Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures, home of the Quarantined Wargamer. I'm Big Lee, and today I want to tell you a tale of an elastic band gun. So today's video is a relatively short one for me because I want to share a very specific anecdote with you. And it stems from a recent conversation I had with some friends about my gaming origins, if you like. So, you know, I've made it clear before, I've mentioned it before, that I started out as a role player. I played D&D and Call of Cthulhu and various other role-playing games in my early teens, and then the group that I was with guys, some of whom I knew at school and some of whom I still play games with today, we moved on and we played Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and we went on to play Warhammer 40k and Epic. So we did, you know, we didn't do any historical stuff, that came a bit later, but that was my origin. I came from there and I eventually moved into historical war games and up to today. But it has to be said that when I actually thought about it, and in the course of this conversation, I realised that possibly I can trace my gamer heritage even earlier still, back to when I was a wee nipper, perhaps 6, 7, 8, you know, well before I'd heard of tabletop games and miniatures. So when I say I wasn't really aware of miniatures, what I wasn't taking into account was the fact that during, like many kids in the sort of like 70s, like I had loads of airfix plastic soldiers. So that we're talking about those 1/32 scale soft plastic figures that were produced in huge quantities, and there probably wasn't a lad up and down the country that didn't own something along those lines. And I had several sets in my collection, if you can call it that, and I fondly remember having you know, British North Africa troops, desert rats, commandos, some sort of generic German infantry in sort of European uniform. And it never occurred to me that putting my desert rats against Germans in European uniform would be an issue. Didn't matter back then. I had Africa Corps troops at one point, and of course a vast assortment of all sorts of guns and vehicles, some plastic, some, I remember some die-cast metal ones, little artillery pieces that could fire matchsticks. And, you know, so like most kids, I would be down on the carpet playing with my toy soldiers. And the imagination would run wild, you know, with these huge stories, and as my troops carried out heroic missions across the carpet and up the sofa and so on. And sometime in the mid-70s-ish, sort of like I started setting troops up and rolling marbles at them to knock down troops, and that would be my way of showing that one side had knocked out a men on the other side. But as you can imagine, that was a rather dangerous pursuit, particularly for the other members of the family who would step on marbles, or if I flicked too hard I'd go pinging off, and my mother was never too happy if I got close to breaking some of the crockery and some of her precious ornaments. And looking back on it as an adult, I do think, Christ, she put up with a lot. So inevitably we moved on to something slightly less dangerous in the form of flicking elastic bands at the troops. So we come to the next development in my wargaming heritage, the elastic band gun. Now, my dad was a bit of a tinkerer. He liked to build things. He obviously had a lot of time on his hands. He was always making stuff from scratch that was over-engineered for the task. But, you know, one day he came back from work and he'd made a pair of elastic band rifles. Now, these things were basically made of 3 layers of plywood with a central section that was the trigger mechanism that pivoted on a little bolt, and essentially you would hook the elastic band on the front, pull it back to the trigger mechanism, and when you pulled the trigger, the lever would push up and flick the band off, and you could fire pretty accurately with this thing. And he made 2 so that my sister could join in, no sexism involved here, and the pair of us would play where we would set our troops up and start shooting them and knocking them over. And, you know, these elastic band guns were about, you know, 18 inches long, so you could fit an assortment of elastic bands. There was little hooks at all different points, so you could use different sizes of elastic bands. And they had pretty good range, especially when I was trying to shoot with my sister, but we won't go there. No rules, just who shoots the fastest and who is the most accurate. So the next step was to make it slightly more sophisticated. So we would have an equal number of figures each, terrain would be books and pillows and whatever else, and we would have the same each, and then we would have to set our troops up in cover, but they had to be at least partially visible to the enemy, my pet name for my sister, sitting across from us. And the idea was that we would have an equal number of elastic bands each, and one of our elastic band guns each, and we would then shoot and try and knock over the enemy's troops, and whoever knocked all of them out first was the winner. Now, I also had a sort of a point system in my head. If I could knock out an enemy figure and hit my sister with the same elastic band, I'd give myself extra points. And as I say, the simple game was, the winner was whoever could knock over all of the enemy's troops first. So okay, it wasn't traditional wargaming as we know it. The rules were basic to say the least, and it was more a game of skills and strategy. But clearly the seeds of a wargaming future were set at a very early age for me. I was playing World War II, and I still do. So I obviously had an interest in that period, and that probably has a lot to do with the sort of films that we watched in the house, the sort of things my dad was interested in. So, probably a video in that at some point in the future. But the whole point of this anecdote is that not all routes into the hobby are traditional. Whatever your origin, whatever your game, if it ultimately led to the games table, then surely that isn't a bad thing. So, whatever we do, we should never discourage people or mock them even for not having come from that traditional, I got me Donald Featherstone down the library and I joined a club, or my teacher taught us, all of the traditional stories, which are all fine. But not every wargamer has that background, particularly the newer generation of gamers that are coming into the hobby. So whatever route led them to the games table is a good thing. Well, I hope you enjoyed that short video. And if you did, as always, please like, subscribe and share. So until next week, as always, keep gaming, stay safe, and of course, keep rolling high.